Good evening. Before we begin this evening, I'd like to invite the chaplain of the Aquinas Series, Father Michael McLean, forward to lead us in prayer.
Lord God, we gather tonight in a quest for truth and for knowledge and wisdom, and ask your blessing upon Leah as she brings her message tonight, her story. We thank you for gathering us together tonight and ask your blessing upon all of us. Give us open hearts and minds to hear your word and your truth, a willingness to share your truth and good news with all those we encounter, knowing that your gifts and your graces are what our world truly needs today. Thank you for all of our sacred journeys of growing closer to you in our hearts and minds. And we thank you for guiding Leah on her path. And we ask these prayers through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Father McLean. I am really excited to continue cultivating this wonderful avenue for learning and community fellowship among members of our parish this evening and the wider community with great Catholic scholars, thinkers, men and women of faith, just all around good people who can share with us their love for their disciplines and their stories. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by St. Dominic Parish and St. Dominic Sacred Music. I encourage you all to keep up to date with the wealth of resources on our parish website. And don't forget to check out all the exciting things happening here in our music program on the sacred music portion of the website. If you have yet to get your copy, the third issue of Canticum Novum newsletter is also available on your way out. Just look for the bright yellow magazine. And finally, if anyone is interested in supporting these lectures or you want to become more involved, please, I encourage you to talk to Father McLean or myself after this evening. We'd love to chat with you. So this series of lectures has been titled the Aquinas Series. St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, also known as the Angelic Doctor, is a saint with whom many of us are familiar, especially given his Dominican roots. He was perhaps the most influential Catholic thinker and writer of the medieval church, and he wrote and preached about what we call the three transcendentals: truth, goodness, and beauty. So with that in mind, it is now my privilege to introduce to you Miss Leah Libreso-Sargeant, our presenter for this evening. She's a writer and an analyst based in New Jersey. A former atheist blogger and writer for the Huffington Post, Ms. Libreso stunned her readers in the summer of 2012 when she announced that she was converting to Catholicism. Raised in an atheist household on Long Island, she had graduated from Yale University in 2011 with a BA in political science. Her writing has appeared in The Washington Post, First Things, The Weekly Standard, The American Interest, The American Conservative, America, and other outlets. She has spoken across the U.S., as well as in Australia, Ireland, and Poland, and she's the author of two wonderful books, Arriving at Amen and Building the Benedict Option, both of which will be available tonight from Leah afterwards. So without further ado, Ms. Libreso, welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for coming out tonight, especially with the heat and the haze. So I began my life growing up as an atheist in a non-religious family, but I think that kind of doesn't give the full sense of how I grew up. So I want to give you a few more details to give really a sense of what my exposure to religion was. When I was in my AP European history class, and we were learning about the Protestant Reformation, one of the kids in my mostly very secular, very Jewish high school raised his hand to ask a question. And he asked our AP Euro teacher, "Do Lutherans still exist?" And the teacher, even before he could answer, one of the boys jumped in to go, "Yes, they do. I'm a Lutheran." And we all turned around and said, "What?" And he's like, "Well, what did you guys assume?" And we're like, "We assumed you were Jewish." Like, everyone in our school is Jewish, mostly not religious. And I think I knew at the time that Lutherans existed, just to be fair to my high school self, but it was the kind of school where that might be an open question. And certainly I didn't know that the large Teutonic blonde boy with a crew cut was, as it happened, a Lutheran. I don't think I could have named anyone in my school who I was very confident was a practicing Christian, even though I'm sure demographically there were some. Which meant that, as someone who was non-religious, a lot of my exposure to what it meant to be a Christian was really filtered through what kind of Christians make the news. And as you can imagine, this is not the most flattering portrait of the good news or of the people who follow Christ. So the kinds of Christians I tended to encounter in high school were all very far away on the TV, and were saying things about how hurricanes kind of chose their path to hit the gayest city in the country. And so I was an atheist, having been brought up one, having never had any reason to reconsider it, and the kind of testimony and witness I saw from Christians didn't give me any cause to reconsider. And I pretty much persisted like that until I went to college. When I went to Yale, I joined a variety of groups. I stayed up too late. I neglected my papers. And one of the groups I joined was a debating group. It was a little unusual. It wasn't the debate team, because on the debate team, you're kind of practicing rhetoric. You're picking sides at random and seeing how well you can defend that side in front of judges. And our debate group was different. No one assigned you to a side. You argued what you actually believed, and no one gave you prizes for doing it. The prize was you might convince someone else they were wrong. You might convince them to change their entire way of life based on the discussion you had, starting on the debate floor, continuing over pizza, sometimes going till 3 in the morning, and then they would live their whole life differently as a result. That was the prize, no trophies. And I loved it. And unsurprisingly, I think the debate team attracted one set of people, a kind of achievement-focused, practiced, polished set of people, and our debate group attracted weirdos who really wanted to argue with people just for the heck of it, who didn't need any adults in the room to praise them, who just found fighting with people was their own reward, and finally had found folks to love in this very particular way. And I was one of these weirdos, and I'll say as a spoiler, my husband is also one of these weirdos, and this is how we met ultimately. It's actually not a bad way to screen people for marriageability, to get together every Thursday night and hear their opinions on every topic you can think of, and ask them questions that they have to answer because they've chosen to take the floor, and then you can gradually make up your mind about whether they're marriage material. We're not the only couple to have met in this way. But in the meantime, I was arguing with people who, not only had I never encountered except on TV, I was encountering people way weirder than just Catholics. I was encountering people who were seasteaders, who were like, I want to live on a boat, and then just never have a citizenship and make all my associations voluntary and be able to sail away the moment I don't agree with someone else. I'm like, I don't have rejoinders to that. I've never heard of that before. And to an extent, my encounters with the Catholics were sort of similar. I came in as someone who was well-read on Dawkins and Hitchens and other prominent atheists, and I found that a lot of the kind of counter-apologetics I'd read were intended for, I'd almost say, lowest common denominator fundamentalism. So I might start talking to a Catholic who was up to fight with me, and I'd be saying this is all very silly. People take a lot of things out of the Bible. You can't say, you just read the Bible and you'll figure everything out by yourself. It's not a self-interpreting book. And the Catholic would go, yes, indeed, it's not exactly a self-interpreting book. That's why we have a whole magisterium and sacred tradition to guide us. I wouldn't tell you to just read the Bible and go try and guess entirely what it means. You want to handle that appropriately with respect and, really read what the church fathers have said. And I'm like, all right, that's a different rejoinder than I expected, so I'll go back and read some other things and come fight with you next week. And a lot of my encounters were like that. It wasn't that I thought the Catholics were right, but a lot of the reasons I thought they were wrong weren't actually reasons about Catholicism. And at the same time, they were really smart, which was new to me, not having really known Christians I could talk to before. So I knew Catholic converts even, who were mathematicians, which to me was the purest form of truth there was. If you were into math, you cared deeply about what is true. Everything you do is shaped by what is and isn't allowed, putting truth first before everything else, even your own sense of aesthetics or your own intuitions. And for someone to be both Christian and a mathematician was really mind-boggling to me. So I had to do more reading to kind of figure out how could I take my new friends, who I loved, and stop them from being Catholic. I wasn't up to the task, but I was sure I could get up to the task with a little more research. And of course, at the same time, I didn't want my friends to just not be Catholic. Because atheist isn't a real philosophy in and of itself. It's an answer to a particular question. Do you believe in God? But atheism by itself isn't something you can found your life on. You can't face a big question, should I tell a lie if it will help this person, and go, well, I don't believe in God. Okay, so what will you do? What are the moral principles you hold to? So I didn't really enter college just as an atheist. If I were, I wouldn't have been able to have moral beliefs at all. I entered college with very strongly held, slightly weird moral beliefs. And I don't know if it will help to say that one of kind of the moral exemplars I thought of people I wanted to pattern myself on, was Inspector Javert from Les Miserables. And you might be thinking, Inspector Javert from Les Miserables is not the hero of Les Miserables. The hero is Jean Valjean, the escaped convict whose life is touched by mercy, who's willing to sacrifice himself, but also willing to extend mercy to others, even to the unyielding, unflexible Javert. I was like, well, that's no good. What I like is Javert, because he cares most of all about the rules. He's not pursuing Valjean out of vengeance. He's not pursuing him for glory. You never get the impression anyone else in the Paris constabulary cares at all about Jean Valjean. Javert cares about what's right, and he's willing to give his whole life to doing what's right, even if no one else cares about catching Valjean. And when he finds himself kind of trapped by his own philosophy, he's unwilling to bend. He'd rather die than extend mercy even to himself, because he's scrupulously fair. He's never given mercy to anyone else, and he won't accept it for himself. And I thought, that's right. That's the way to live. Javert is absolutely fair, and he never is selfish. He's always willing to put what's right above himself. I don't think there are that many people who in high school take Javert as their moral icon, but there was a system of philosophy that kind of played into this ideal that I had, and it was deontology. And when you talk about different ways of deciding moral questions, a lot of people care about utilitarianism. They care about what will happen if I make this decision. I'll decide what's right. I'll decide whether to tell a lie based on whether I think people will be better off or worse off. I didn't like this at all. It didn't seem rooted in what was true. It seemed unbelievably circumstantial. It seemed like you could be morally blackmailed, where someone's like, well, I'll just find even more people to help as long as you're willing to do something wrong, and then it will make it right. If I go give $5 to 1,000 poor people, if you kick this dog, can't you say that that outweighs the dog kicking? I was like, I'm not going to negotiate with someone like that. I don't believe it's the outcomes that make things work, and I don't believe you can kind of weight them as you please to offset bad behavior. I care about deontology, like Javert. Deontology is as close as you can get to just being a mathematician, I feel like, in the world of moral philosophy. Because deontology cares about the rules. You don't start with, well, what do I want to do? Or what will happen if I do this? You just start with, is this an acceptable thing to do, yes or no? Should I lie to help these people? No. Lying is wrong. End of story. Well, what if it's a bunch of people? Nope. Well, what if it's I don't care. I care about what's right, just like Javert. And you can't trick me by kind of fudging the numbers. You start with what's right, and you just deal with what those consequences are. So when I was arguing with my Catholic friends, I wasn't trying to get them just not to be Catholic. I wanted them to be weirdo, intense, deontologist atheists like me. And part of the reason I felt so strongly about this is the one thing I knew most of all about morality was that it was real and that it mattered. It was something so foundational that it was the hardest thing to argue for. Because in some ways, arguing with someone who says that morality is just socially constructed or imaginary or just happens to be what we all agreed to, for me is like arguing with someone who says this podium doesn't exist. I'm just pretending it exists. We all live our lives premised on the material reality of the world around us and the moral reality of the world around us. And as I understood it, morality is something we discover. It's not something we make. It's something like mathematics. We uncover it like archaeologists, and we receive what we find. But we can't redesign it. like architects, or build it up from nothing to suit our own plans and our own expectations. So that was kind of my gospel of atheist deontology moral realism that I was trying to bother my friends with. They had an advantage over me, which is that there are a lot of Christians who have written books, and there are not that many atheist deontologists, moral realists who love Javert who have also written books. So when we were kind of arguing and swapping reading material, they had a lot more to draw on than I did. I kept even reading through different atheist books that came out, hoping to find other people who agreed with me and being like, well, no, but one day I'll write this down and then people can use my book to explain why you should be an atheist. But in the meantime, there were two books that really struck me about what Christianity was that my friends suggested I read. And the first was C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And in part, it stuck with me because it was the book I wanted to use to argue with my own position. Except really, I wanted just the first 2 or 3 chapters. Because the initial part of Lewis's book is all making the case for what I already believed. That the moral law is real. That we all already know it's real prior to an argument. And he suggests, if you meet someone who says that morality is just a social convention and not meaningful, that you just cut in front of them at line somewhere. And then observe how quickly they say that this is unfair. Not just unfair in a broad social sense, but deeply and basically unfair. He feels like this is the way to explain moral realism to people. But he also has a longer explanation I just found so beautiful and so rooted in truth that I was prepared to forgive him the rest of the book that was all about how this led to Christianity. I really considered Xeroxing the first chapter or 2 and using that as my apologetics just for my position and being like, but then he went a little astray, we'll have to forgive him, but this part's very good. But the thing I could concede, even while not being persuaded by Lewis's book, is that same reasonable, careful logic I was reading in those first few chapters, rooted in what I already knew was true. It was the same man writing both parts of the book. So reading Mere Christianity really convinced me, not that Christianity was true, but that there were ways to articulate it and believe in it while being reasonable and smart and thoughtful. I was reading it. There was no denying that. I didn't think it was true, but I didn't think it was dumb. I didn't think it was easily dismissible. I thought it had to be refuted in some way. Now, the second book that my friend suggested I read was a little different in tone. It was G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. And if you think about, or if you've read these books, I feel like the tone of them is that C.S. Lewis is like sitting down with you, friend to friend. Oh, it's a quiet day, maybe you're on a little walk, and he's saying no, it's all quite reasonable. You believe most of it already, and it holds together in a very simple way. Everyone really assents to this, and it's simple, it's peaceful, it's a relief in some way. There you go. And it's calming. It's a nice way to spend an afternoon with a friend. G.K. Chesterton, by contrast, is a theologian and an apologetics writer, bursts into your house through the window, right? Just straight up smashes the panes of glass and climbs in and sticks his head through to say, did you know that Christianity is insane? If you have friends who are Christian and you think it's false, you should stop them, because if it's false, it's the very worst thing in the world. And if it's true, it's the very best. And then he pops back out the window to do it to your neighbor. His whole book is like that. It's very beautifully written. But if you read Lewis and think I can live alongside Christians, they've got some basically good ideas. Chesterton is really there to tell you, you cannot live alongside Christians. You either have to join them or stop them. The stakes are very high and the claims are very big. And there is no point being a Christian if it's not true, and in fact, it would be monstrous to be a Christian if it weren't true. So make up your mind, now. This put me in a kind of awkward emotional position, obviously. So I was trying to explore these ideas, and I was kind of getting to a point where, even though I had kind of Chesterton's big warning ringing in my head, I did think that Christianity, in particular Catholicism, held together pretty well. I didn't think it was true, but I thought people had put a lot of thought into it, and I mostly gave it credit because it was old. I thought, well, people have had a lot of time to kind of find the strains in this theology and come up with solutions to them. So mostly this holds together. It might be crazy just by itself to be against contraception, But it's less crazy if you're also pro-life and think that marriage doesn't admit of the possibility of divorce. It might be crazy, to believe in the Eucharist, unless you already believe in Jesus. And then these two things are both weird, but they're kind of strange in the same way. In fact, I thought it was weirder to believe in Christ and then believe that he asked us every Sunday to get together and eat simply bread and simply wine as a kind of, reunion without any actual sacramental heft to it. So I kept thinking, well, I don't believe in Christianity, but if there were a Christianity, the Catholics seem to have the right of it. And at the same time, I was still working on my own moral philosophy and trying to faithfully explore the gaps or errors in it before my friends could get to them. And because I wanted, if you think of your own theology, your religion, your philosophy as a house, you want to be able to invite your friends in to live there. So I wanted everything well taken care of, the beds freshly made so that people could come in and be weirdo, atheist, deontologist, moral realists who love Javert. So I was kind of finding the sore parts of my philosophy and trying to poke on them a little. And the thing that turned out to be toughest for me, the thing that I could admit didn't quite seem to work initially, was that the whole point of deontology is that the moral law is universal. It binds on me the same way as it does on you, Father, the same way it does on you. It doesn't matter which of us is doing it. What matters is what's right. And I could tell there was something not quite right in the way I was thinking about it. Because the way I thought about it, if what matters is doing what's right no matter the cost, it did feel like the coolest thing, like the best thing, the most virtuous thing, is doing what's right at incredible cost. I wanted to be not just a good person, but a really good person. And that meant I kind of hoped not just I would decide in small stakes thing, I'm not going to lie about this, lying is wrong, but that someone would offer me a tempting but terrible choice, and I'd be able to say no, not even to save 10,000 lives will I tell one lie, and just feel really, really great about how strong I was. And this meant I sort of didn't always think of other people as people, which was the core of my mistake. I thought of people almost as though they were walking moral SAT questions. As I moved through the world, someone might kind of pose me a moral question in their behavior, and I would have the chance to do the right thing at them. This is actually a great way to go through high school as someone who was very weird, because it meant I got really energized by people not particularly liking me, and then being intensely nice to them because it was the right thing to do. And the more someone was unpleasant to me, the more excited I got in some ways. I'm that was a really jerky thing they did. So now, if I'm nice to them, it counts double. It wouldn't be as exciting if everyone were nice to me, because what credit would there be to me in that? But if folks don't like me and then I'm nice to them, that's how I want to live my whole life. But this is a little unfair. I'm asking all of you to kind of take the moral hit of being jerks so that I can be really cool by being nice to all of you. I'd feel disappointed if we were all very moral people and treating each other well and there was no way to show off what I could do. And this actually came to a head over what was a very, very small dispute within my debate organization. I tell you this to really show that God can bring good out of the absolute pettiest of fights, when he is willing to work on that and when we're willing to hear him. Because we had gotten to what I can only describe as a multi-day, knocked out, drag-out fight over whether at our prize debate, which is the only one at which there was a prize, do the prize debates go on too long and it's tedious for the judges, was the question. Should we ban all the freshmen from competing, which I was against? Should we limit speeches by 30 seconds relative to last year's speeches, which I was against? I wanted more people to get to speak, and I wanted them to have enough time to make their case. My opponent, who we'll call Matilda for the purposes of this evening, because she's lived a long life that's not defined by this incident, didn't want the freshmen to speak and wanted the speeches shortened so everyone could go home earlier. You wouldn't think that this relatively minor dispute would result in language that I'm not going to repeat in a church. It's very gendered and offensive insults directed at my person. And I was upset. So I was talking to my boyfriend at the time, who I will disappoint you by saying is not my husband of the time, but was also from our debate group, who was Catholic, who was the one I'd been sharing lots of these books back and forth with. I was ticked off, and he said, well, I'm going to pray for Matilda. I'm like, why would you do that? He's like, well, she shouldn't be treating you the way she's treating you. I'm like, well, don't go running to God to ask him to make things easier on me. I'm not a wuss. Why would you do that? If you're going to do anything, and I don't believe in prayer, but ask God to make me more firm in doing the right thing. But I don't want to ask him to make stuff easier. That would just be saying, and this is how I envisioned it, dear Lord, I know what the right thing to do is, but I don't feel like doing it. Please make Matilda nice to me so that I don't have to do the right thing. And Chris was like, that's not how I was going to frame that prayer at all, but that's also not what I'm thinking about. I'm not really thinking just about you here. I'm like, well, I don't understand. And he said, I think it's bad for Matilda that she said that thing to you over this, regardless of whether you do the right thing or not. I think it's bad for her, because she shouldn't be this angry over something like that. It's bad for her whole life if she can't break free of anger in this way. And I was really thrown by this, because I wasn't thinking about Matilda as a person at all. And in some ways, neither was she thinking of me that way. We just had made that error in different tones. She made it in anger at me, and I kind of had this cold dispassion, but neither of us thought of the other person as a person in that moment. Because it didn't occur to me that it might be tough for Matilda to be irrationally angry at me, and that she might be happier and freer being loosed from that. If I had been trying to extend compassion, I would have thought well, maybe it's exciting for Matilda that she is so angry at me, and now she has the chance to be really good by being nice to me despite being angry. And that's kind of the gap between the deontology I was practicing and the philosophy I took on next, which was virtue ethics. Because in deontology, it's so morally heroic to make your choices like you're walking into a windstorm, moving through against this intense temptation to speak sharply to someone, going hello, Matilda, it's nice to see you. Did it, yes. But in virtue ethics, that's not heroic at all. If you're working that hard to do the right thing, you still have a lot to do to kind of internalize the right thing, to have it become natural to you, not a big strain. Virtue ethics, in some sense, claims we're made for the moral law. It's proper to us. In the same way, posture is proper to us, even though a bunch of us may slump day to day. But it's what our bodies are made for, what makes them healthiest and strongest. And in the same way that we can move with grace, the way that you'll see a dancer, not even on stage, just walking across the street, moves with a unity to her movements because her whole body is aligned and working to one purpose together. We can have that same gracefulness pervade our moral actions, where our will and our reason and our conscience are all aligned to what we're made for, the moral law. And we don't look like we're white-knuckling through being kind to people. It may not even stand out to us as a choice anymore because it happens so naturally. Because we made the moral law who we are, not just a thing we follow. I'd never thought this way about what it could look like to be good. I'd always prized effort over real life within what was right. And so that's when I found the third book that was very important to me, which is Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, which is a whole book on virtue ethics. And I took that book to my Catholic boyfriend of the time and said, all right, forget the deontology, this book is how I want to live the whole rest of my life. I understand now why we disagreed at this point, several months ago, because it takes time to work through these ideas. But you should read this, and this is true, and when you stop being Catholic one day, I want you to do this instead. And then Chris looked at me and says, you know what happened to Alistair MacIntyre, right? I'm like, what, did he write more books? Should I read them? He goes, Alistair MacIntyre's Catholic now. He didn't think this stood up on its own, so now he's Catholic. I was like, well, the heck with him, Not with his philosophy, which was good, but I thought, well, if Alistair MacIntyre dropped the baton on being, the big evangelist for atheist virtue ethics, I will pick it up, and I will take on the work he is neglecting. So that's kind of where I proceeded. The boyfriend and I broke up. We remained close friends. But I kind of, by the time I graduated from college, had this problem. On the one hand, I had Catholicism, which held together suspiciously well, but which I didn't think was true. And on the other hand, I had my virtue ethicist atheism, which didn't have a single piece of it I thought was false. It was smaller than Catholicism, but it didn't include anything false, which, for my love of mathematics, that was the most important thing. You can only build on from what you're confident of. It had gaps. It couldn't do everything Catholicism could do, but I was 22. I needed time to fill those gaps in. I didn't see an advantage to kind of taking in a whole that I couldn't trust completely in favor of holding to an incomplete thing that I didn't doubt at all. So I kind of went on like that for a little bit until I came back for a debate reunion the year after my senior year. Because, as I said, we were big weirdos, so we would get together multiple times a year to hold debates, to drink toasts to not each other, but philosophical concepts. I looked forward to this. I came back, and I had the weirdest feeling all throughout the debate. I had a feeling that I understood in an intensely statistical mode, so I will give you that explanation first, and then the plain English one. One of the methods I'd learned as a statistician is something called k-means clustering, and it's for when you have a big mess of data and you don't really understand it. And so you're looking at your big mess of data and you're asking, is it clumpy? If I look at this data, does it seem to have clumps and clusters in it? And the nice thing about the technique is you don't have to understand what the clusters are. You're just saying, does this seem mostly even? Or does it seem like there's some natural groups within them? And once I find them, I can try and see if I can figure out what they are. And so someone from Mars could use k-means clustering, because you don't have to know anything contextually about what you're looking at. You just have to go, is it lumpy? Does it fall into groups? And someone coming to my debate group could look at all of us and not really understand religion, but could listen to our arguments and go, are some of these people on the same side? And that's k-means clustering. We do it kind of casually. It's just going like, are there groups here that I may not understand, but I can see that some of these folks are more aligned with each other than others? And I just had the very strange feeling all throughout the debate, which was not a debate on religion, that if you came into the room and did k-means clustering, you would put me with the Catholics. That if you tried to draw a little line around the different groups, I was with them. Now, the Catholics weren't all on the same side of the argument, but whatever specific position they were arguing for, all of the Catholics were arguing from a common understanding of who the human person was. They just disagreed a little about what the exact implications were for the question under consideration. And I could tell I sounded like them, and I felt like I was one of them, even though I wasn't. I found this unsettling. I think in retrospect, this was the work of the Holy Spirit, but I'm the only person who's ever used work of the Holy Spirit and k-means clustering in the same paragraph to my knowledge, so I didn't recognize it that way at the time, especially still being an atheist. But after the debate, we got together to toast. We're passing around a big cup. We're giving toasts to friendship, sometimes to enmity, depending on how you're feeling that night. And it's going around, and instead of coming up with a witty and impressive toast, I have this strong impulse to toast the Nicene Creed and become Catholic. And I think this is crazy. And the cup is getting closer and closer, so there's a real deadline for deciding this. And I think, okay, no, this is crazy, because first of all, I don't know that I know the Nicene Creed by heart, and I'm not going to read it off my phone. That's ridiculous. Second of all, I don't think that is how you become Catholic. In fact, I know folks who have become Catholic. They don't do it by toasting the Nicene Creed at a toasting ceremony. And if I'm becoming Catholic, I should do it in a way that accords with Catholicism, not with the weird culture of my debate group. And third, I don't believe in God. Looking over this list, I really should have said 3 first. It's the more important reason. I don't know why it took me so long to get to I don't believe in God. And I felt unsettled. So the cup comes around. I give some toast that's probably very lousy because there's been so much going on, and I try and let this pass. And during that time, what I'm still wrestling with is one problem in particular, the one issue with my kind of incomplete virtue ethics that I'm not sure I can patch. And the issue is, I know that I know the moral law. I know I have access to it. How do I have knowledge of it? Well, this isn't a question people always give you a hard time about. You know, my friends were giving me a hard time about it because I had friends who didn't believe in moral law or didn't believe it was real. But there are kind of related questions that no one gives you a hard time about. You know, I walked around saying I believe the moral law is real, that it's transcendent, it's beyond what humans can make, and that I know it. You know, imperfectly, but I know it. I also walk around saying, hey, I believe that math is transcendent, it's beyond what humans can make, I have imperfect knowledge of it. And people mostly don't give me a hard time about math. They don't say, how dare you do addition without being able to justify where your sense of what numbers are comes from. But they would say this about ethics, and to me they were the same problem. They were both things that were beautiful, true, transcendent, that I could only explore, not make, and they felt like the same kind of thing. But I had an easier story I could tell about how I knew about math than how I knew about ethics, and it kept niggling at me that it didn't feel satisfactory on the other side. And the math story is kind of the same story Plato tells. It's basically saying, well, you know, I may not be able to look on math, pure math directly, but I can see things in the world that reflect it and kind of understand what they must reflect. So I can say, you know, well, I have 2 shoes, and I have 2 feet, and I can even see there's this kind of matching between my shoes and my feet that shows the quantity is the same. Shoes and feet are very different things, Plato would say, and yet I can see this unity between them. So what is it? And he'd say, well, shoes and feet in this instance participate in the form of two-ness. And two itself is abstract and beautiful and not limited to feet or shoes or pews or anything else, but it's real, it's important, and we see little instantiations of it in our day-to-day life. Perhaps you have not spent nights awake thinking, how can I justify my belief in the quantity two? But Plato did, and that's how he did it, right? And so that, you can kind of go from there, well, then I can get to 3, and I can go backwards to 1, and once I have the natural numbers, you can actually get to pretty much everywhere else in math from there, so you're safe, right? That ladder holds, you can all go home and be mathematicians tonight and not stay up worrying if it's allowed, if you're claiming an illicit knowledge you have no right to. Perhaps you were not planning to stay up at night worrying about that, but I hope you feel better now. But I didn't feel the same way about ethics. It felt like it was sort of the same kind of problem, but I didn't find this answer satisfying. Because if I were going to extend the math example to the moral question, I would say, well, I observe someone commit financial fraud on a vulnerable adult, and I observe someone kick a puppy, and I see that these two things are unlike each other and yet like each other, and they participate in the form of cruelty. And I think it's true. I think they do both partake of cruelty, but I don't think that's how I know it. I can see how the math example, it's much more obvious. You can literally line things up next to each other to check the correspondence exists and to be intrigued by it. Little kids do it. My daughter's 1.5. She doesn't do it yet, but she'll get interested in this question at some point in this way. But I didn't really believe what I was saying. I didn't think these two examples were so like each other that it was putting them next to each other and contrasting that was how I knew about cruelty. I felt I knew about cruelty and I recognized it in both. So it was time to go back to Yale for another reunion. And we were debating resolved, nationalize the curriculum, which, as I think Father can confirm, is a prudential question for Catholics. The Catholic Church does not issue a binding teaching on at what level should curriculum be determined. It gives us some guidelines to consider. So it felt very unfair to be at this debate, which did not really touch directly on Catholicism in any way, and to have the same weird k-means clustering feeling all throughout the debate. And to keep feeling, I can see this group of people and I know that I'm with them, and I can see we care about the same kinds of truth, and it's very frustrating. And so finally, when the debate was over, I didn't want to go to the toasting session. I felt like, what if the same thing happens, and I still don't have a good answer to the cup which isn't a person, it's a cup. Like, it can't demand of me whether I'm becoming Catholic or not. So I'm skipping the toasting session. I'm grabbing a friend of mine who I know wants to become, a Protestant pastor. And so I'm going to just grab him and we'll both skip toasting and we'll talk about theology. And if he doesn't like it, maybe he shouldn't become a pastor. I will say as a happy ending that he's currently in formation in an Anglican seminary, so this didn't dissuade him from religious life. But I did think part of being a religious minister is having people grab you at odd hours and saying, I need to talk about how we come to know the moral law, and you just having to roll with it. So my friend Ben rolled with it. And instead of going to toasting, we stayed up very late in his dorm room talking about this. And I'm really walking him through what I've walked you through. This sense that on the one hand, Catholicism is beautiful. It's intricate. It all holds together. It's like an elaborate clockwork mechanism that doesn't run. I don't think there's something true at the heart of it to drive it. I can see how it would run if someone turned it on. But there's nothing there. So I can't take this dead thing, no matter how intricate and interesting it would be if it could work. And on the other hand was my virtue ethics, which looks more like a very patched over incomplete quilt. And it has this one suspicious part that I don't know if I can patch. But there's nothing wrong with it, so shouldn't I keep working on this, right? And so that I laid out all before Ben, and then he heard a much longer version of the participates in the form of cruelty thing that you guys heard. And Ben said, well, it sounds like that's something you don't think works. So instead of kind of rehashing that Platonic argument repeatedly, at least try something new. If you don't think you come to know morality that way, but you know it, how could that be? And then I just blurted out without thinking about it. I guess morality just loves me or something. And then the next thing I said was like, Ben, take that smile off your face. Let me see if I think what I just said. But I did. I took some time and sat with it. But what I felt was, if I was here, a limited person, a human being, and morality was transcendent, beyond what I could make, beyond so far what I'd had any way of arguing I could even build a ladder up to, and yet I had knowledge of it, then that knowledge wasn't the result simply of my own efforts and reasoning. That knowledge was a gift. It was coming the opposite way. It was coming to me instead of me climbing up to it. And at that point, I'm not talking just about the moral law as some kind of abstract rule book that I'm exploring. Because I'm saying that it comes to me. I'm not talking about it as an it anymore. I'm talking about it as an agent, something that acts in the world, something that can move and move towards me deliberately. And I didn't say, and it moves towards me by random motion. I said, morality loves me. I couldn't picture what rightness was acting except out of concern for what was right. And that there is a kind of tenderness in offering you something you couldn't have by yourself, simply because it is good for you to have it. And at that point, once I was saying, well, the form of goodness itself, as an active agent, acting out of love to lower itself to me, I knew who I was talking about. It's the incarnation, right? It's what God does for all of us, lowering himself to take the form of a slave, meeting us where we are, doing for us in the crucifixion what we cannot do for ourselves, and incorporating us into who he is and into his sacrifice when none of this is possible for us as created beings burdened by sin. And at that moment, it was like that whole mechanism finally had the lights go on and start whirring into life. And so I asked Ben, what should we do now? And he's like, well, we should pray night office. I think canonically it was 2 a.m, so I don't know if that's exactly what we should have done, but it is what we did. We prayed night office. Well, what should we do now? And he's like, we should put on Mumford & Sons really loudly and dance around. I'm like, okay, let's do that. What should we do now, Ben? And he's like, well, we should go to bed because it's very late at night. And so I walked back to where I was staying across the campus, in the very late night, almost morning, And the next morning, I went to Mass for the first time as someone who believed that at Mass, it wasn't just an interesting story that held together in an interesting way, but that Christ was present on the altar, and that I had the hopes of receiving him after RCIA. And that morning was Palm Sunday as he entered in to Jerusalem and into my heart. And I've been so lucky, and I feel that God has been so generous with me, because I wasn't prepared to encounter religion as religion, almost. God came and found me and pursued me using every love I already had and every bit of language I already knew, through mathematics, through just a real kind of mixed inclination to love fighting with people, through k-means clustering, right, which I've never actually used professionally. It just was important in my conversion, it turns out. That's why I learned it, I guess. And there was nothing God wouldn't stoop to get my attention, to find something that was true or good or beautiful that I loved, even if it was a small part of the true, the good, and the beautiful, a small instantiation of it, to draw my attention to him, who is the true, the good, the beautiful. And one thing that's so exciting to me now as a mother is that my daughter's 1.5 years old, and she gets to be Catholic from the beginning. For me, the process of conversion after deciding to convert was a process of learning, how do I make space for God initially? I've never been used to making space for him. I've never been used to talking to him. I've only talked about him to other people. So how do I learn to make space for him? And of course, this was the wrong question. I'm still working my way past it. I don't need to make space for God. All of time is his. Everything is his. How do I become aware moment to moment that I am already with God and be attentive to him? But for my daughter, my hope is that being raised by my husband and me as a Catholic from the beginning, that it won't be a question of, well, at what point do I decide to pay attention to God, but of always knowing that God is with her. At this age, it takes kind of a couple different forms, but she does say and does her name sign for Jesus as we go past the church or go in. She's, in fact, such a Catholic toddler that we found out that she thinks all statues are statues of Mary. Because we were passing a statue of St. Francis, and she pointed to it very confidently, went, meh. And we're like, it's St. Francis, meh. And I don't really know what God is doing for her right now. I know what my husband and I are trying to do for her, but looking to what he's done in my own life and all the small things that he was calling my name and urging me to come find him and come listen to what he was already saying, I realize I have no idea what he's saying to my daughter, and in what ways in her toddler-like loves he's already working in her heart. But for the whole rest of my life, I get to look at the world knowing God is in every part of it, and everything in the world and every person in the world is an invitation to turn our hearts completely to him. Every moment of our day can be offered to him. Even the hardest parts of our life are moments to draw closer to him in the cross. And there's never a moment where I need to kind of look for God again. I just have to look to see how God is revealing himself to me in this moment. Thank you. I do have time for some questions if people have any about my conversion or mathematics, whatever strikes your fancy. Can you speak up a little bit? Just. Well, I think that's interesting, the gap between being a convert or a cradle Catholic. Because in some ways I feel like, and you're not the first person to say wow, it sounds like there's so much more that's deliberate about being a Catholic when you're a convert. But I don't think it's better. It's good for me, since otherwise I wouldn't have been. But it's not better, because that's kind of like that distinction between doing the right thing through great effort or doing it more naturally. I don't want my daughter to be a convert like me. In the same way, I don't want her to not love me as her mother for a long period of time and then gradually learn to do it and value it the more for having struggled. I think that people who are cradle Catholics always have the opportunity to be saints, and that we shouldn't undervalue just a quiet life lived closely with God, even though it has kind of fewer dramatic ups and downs than mine does. It was a big mix because of the debate group, basically. So I had the unusual thing of that I was nobody's first Catholic convert, just because, perhaps unsurprisingly, a debate group where people really talk about what's true and pursue that question faithfully in love with friends produces a lot of converts. So I had atheists who think I'm wrong, but no one was having kind of the first shock of someone becoming Catholic, because we all knew upperclassmen who had done the same thing, even if, for slightly different reasons. It was something that I didn't agree with the church on initially. And when I became Catholic, I knew I had to go along with the church, but that didn't mean I had full understanding of it from the beginning. And I think coming to understand it not just as a matter of obedience, but as something I actually believed, took a while and wasn't one dramatic moment, but a lot of small things adding up. Where one of them was just, I do feel like I was misinformed as a young person about what babies in the womb are actually like. And I remember that when I was pregnant with my daughter, I know people have talked about ultrasounds changing people's minds, but I actually think, some of the pregnancy apps people have on their phones change people's minds, because I was shocked, at what age she looked like a very tiny, enormous-headed person. And I genuinely hadn't known that. And I would pass around kind of the image of an 8-week-old baby, not as a propaganda thing, just because I was pregnant and I was excited to show people. And my coworkers said, okay, but this isn't what the baby looks like right now, is it? And I'm like, it turns out it is, right? But I didn't know. So I think that was part of it, but that by itself, it's moving, but I didn't find it totally convincing. I'd heard people make similar arguments with kind of less impressive pictures. And again, because of how I felt about morality, I'm like, I don't want to be tricked by just pictures, I want to know what's right. And so a big part of changing my mind about what was right came out of really understanding better the Catholic respect for weakness and dependence. That as an atheist, everything I did could only succeed or not by my own efforts, ultimately. And that limited how much good I could do, but it meant I was really assiduous about doing it. But as a Catholic, I know the limitedness of my own efforts. I can still be ambitious and try and do things, and now it's because I think God can do more with what I put forward than what I can do. And so when I take a chance, it's because I expect God to continue doing the work. And so I do more than I can bite off in some ways. It actually really comes up in some ways in hoping other people will convert. As an atheist, it's up to me to argue with them, and if I walk away, it's over, possibly. And as a Catholic, I believe that sometimes my job is just preparing the soil for something someone else is going to say that's actually important to them, or preparing them to be up to listen to that person. So in a lot of ways, becoming Catholic meant changing my view of what strength was, just like I changed my view of kind of what moral strength was, and recognizing not only on the issue of life in the womb, but in terms of what a good death looks like. That a good death isn't something that we have total control over and plan in a way to avoid burdening other people, that it's a way of uniting our burdens with Christ, but also recognizing it's not so different from living day to day, where we are kind of hamstrung by our own weaknesses even when we're in full health. And we always have to be unashamed of them and going to confession to remedy them. And it's much less embarrassing to be physically weak than to be morally weak. We treat physical weakness as though it's so terrible it can't be seen in public. But the worst palsy, the greatest paralysis, like the worst attack of dementia is less embarrassing and less an attack on our dignity than the smallest sin. They felt mixed, My parents are college professors. They're real intellectual curiosity. I take after them in many ways, though in some ways not in this. And I think what they respected was my process of getting here. My parents had always raised me to seek the truth fearlessly. They couldn't quibble with my methods, right? But I think we both have hope of being reunited, that we disagree on what side, right? And we both believe that the best way to do that is to ask questions and try and answer them honestly. But it's slow going, I'll say. Yeah. I think the three books I named are kind of the ones that had the biggest turning point effects in my conversion. But, there are some books I read and reread because they're almost like a refresher in what it means to pray. So there's a book called The Presence of God by a Dominican friar that I just find very moving. It's very short. A Dominican gave it to me for preparation for baptism. And it's a book I reread every now and then because it helps me remember what prayer is. Something I feel like I can pray and then forget. And then there are other books that were works of fiction that kind of helped me picture what a Christian life looked like. And in some cases, they were weird books. The Brothers Karamazov was a book where I read it and felt like I had a very strong sense of a Christian life from the testimony of the elder Zosima in the kind of woven throughout the book. But in the meantime, it's just murders and drinking and a lot of other things going on and people falling short of the Christian life. So it's not a book I can kind of unreservedly recommend and say, like, read this and you'll understand Christian life. The answer is sometimes you will. Sometimes you'll say, wow, the Karamazovs are a terrible family. And I was so moved by the Christian witness in the book that I liked the book a lot better the first time when that was startling to me. And when I reread it with friends, I'm like, I don't know that the plot makes very much sense, because I was no longer shocked by the Christianity. And Dostoevsky actually intended to write a whole sequel, but he didn't. And reading it the second, I'm like, I do feel the lack of a sequel. I don't know that I love this book as much now, but it gave me what I needed the first time I read it. I think the book I can recommend, even upon reread, is Kristen Lavren's Daughter by Sigrid Undset. And I also loved her biography of Catherine of Siena, which is a very frightening biography, but very startling and bracing. But the thing about Kristen Lavren's Daughter is it's an epic of a woman who's an ordinary woman in medieval Norway. And it treats her life as an epic, and it is in many ways. She has tumultuous births, there are revenge murders, and it was funny because, again, rereading it, there was a lot more violence than I remembered because I'd been so touched by the book and going like, wow, it's a whole epic about the small movements of God in one woman's soul. And it ends in this profoundly peaceful way. And I recommended it to people like this. Then we read it together and people going, Leah, it ends in the middle of a plague where everyone dies. And I'm like, yes, that is true. And there were a lot of murders with axes. And I'm like, that is true. And and one of her sons attacks the priest on the grounds of the church with an axe. I'm like, and that was wrong, and he's, punished for that. But in the middle of all that tumult, the thing that comes through so clearly in her writing is grace. And she makes grace the most important thing, even in the tumult of her life. And the small moments of when she's either attentive to God or turning from God feel like they're the most dramatic thing in the novel. So I stand by, it ends so peacefully, even though bodies are literally piling up around her. And that was very moving. I think the good thing about fiction is it lets us kind of see theology applied and see what the movements of the soul look like internally so we can recognize them in ourselves. I think C.S. Lewis does this very well in the Screwtape Letters and The Great Divorce, where that was the book that made the idea that hell could exist and that could be right make sense to me. Because I'm reading through these different moral errors people are making, like, well, that's so stupid. Why would you pick that? Why would you hold on to this sin over heaven? I'm reading through them and I get to the one that kind of reflects a temptation of mine. I'm like, oh, well, I don't know. Would I rather be important in some way? Not famous, just needed. Or would I rather be in heaven? I'm like, okay, I know what the answer is supposed to be, but I want to be useful. And it says, in heaven, you are not useful at all. That's not what it's about. That was the one where I felt really torn, it's embarrassing, but I love Lewis's moral writing for this reason, because he shows us both the smallness and the pettiness of sin, of how very, very little the devil offers us to try and get us to choose against God, and then still also shows us why we have trouble saying no. And it makes it easier for me to kind of recognize that again outside the book and remember, oh, I do want to say no to this. It's hard, but I want to. It's a really dumb thing to want over wanting God. Yeah, so this will be perhaps the final math analogy of the night. But in mathematics, you can have a set of propositions that all hold together without them being kind of true in one sense. They're consistent, but they don't describe what you're looking at. And the example is that you've probably learned some geometry that's all about geometry basically on a flat sheet of paper, triangles and parallel lines and so on, and parallel lines don't meet, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all true on a flat sheet of paper. It's not true on a sphere. There's different rules for geometry on a sphere, and they're consistent rules, but they're different rules. So that you can have a triangle with interior angles that are all right angles on a sphere because there's space for it, because there's curvature. And so the question with math isn't always just, is it consistent, but is it true? Like in this sense, is it describing the actual problem I'm looking at? And the non-math analogy would really be that in fantasy novels, you can have a whole world that feels well written and lived in. And you can have fantasy novels that really don't hit that bar, where you're like, well, this would never work. You know, maybe the story is interesting or the characters are interesting, but the world is completely implausible. Versus, you know, I think Tolkien's, you know, Middle-earth feels lived in. He's certainly put enough thought into every single piece of it, though that's not always what you have to do to make a plausible world. So it's almost like it's an alternate geometry, right? It's a different world that doesn't happen to be real, but it feels real from the inside. It's consistent from the inside. If you woke up there, you wouldn't go, hang on, someone wrote all this, and it's contrived, and I don't believe it. That's what I thought about Catholicism. It worked from the inside, but only if you were inside. And from the outside, you had to have a reason to go in. Well, my husband is a convert from Anglicanism, so he had a much shorter trip. And the thing that's very moving about his story, which is more his to tell than mine, is that his family all came together. It was a mix of being drawn towards the church and unfortunately kind of being shoved towards the door by the Anglican Church in America. But they all entered the church together while he was in college, so he was kind of getting long-distance RCIA so that they could enter together as a family, which he did on Palm Sunday, I think a year after I changed my mind. He and his family all entered the church on Palm Sunday together in Philadelphia, in the church where we were eventually married. And I do benefit enormously. He didn't grow up as a Catholic, but he grew up as a Christian. So, especially when we're parenting together, I look to him because he knows what it's like to be a child who believes in God in a way I don't. And can kind of help me figure out how to set an example for my daughter in a way I don't entirely understand myself from experience. I think I'll close by just telling you one very fun thing from one of my friend's children, but that kind of sets my example for what does it mean to really raise a child to be Catholic from the beginning, to know God in all things rather than to struggle and discover him later, and really miss the time I could have spent with him. I have friends who are Eastern Orthodox, and for them, one thing that's really beautiful about their prayer life is it's so embodied, so a child can easily participate. There's a lot of kissing of icons, kissing of crosses held out to you by the priest. And a child may not be able to say a whole prayer, but they can pray by kissing, by reverencing things that are holy. It's something we do in our own house. We have a little icon of the Holy Family that Beatrice kisses because we want her to be able to pray now, even though she can't speak yet very much. And so their daughter once was on her scooter, and was scooting by a Methodist church just as they got out of their Sunday gathering. And she just like walks through the Methodist and goes up to the large cross they have on their lawn and goes over to kiss it. And I think this was surprising to the Methodists, even though they'd all just been at prayer, because there was just an immediacy and, both a humility and kind of a shocking intimacy to that form of prayer. I think that's threaded all through Catholicism. I think that's something that unites us with our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters. That, like Chesterton said, Catholicism is insane. How can you say both? That God is who he is. He's not just a better person. He's not a kind of God within creation. He is the creator. He is goodness himself. He is all-powerful. And yet, he's on the altar for us to eat. It's impossible except that God does it, right? That we have that real sense of our own smallness, and yet we have the audacity to approach God so closely because he has invited us to.
We thank you, Lord, for this time together tonight, and ask you to guide each of us in our journeys of deepening our relationship with you, to see the wonders of your creation, and to wake up each day ready to see the gifts that you have for us, and to just give us hearts of courage and love to seek you out in every way that we can. And we ask all these prayers through Christ our Lord. Amen.